I am happy to introduce Chris Lemon from Northman High School. Chris is a Spanish teacher. He started his teaching career as a Fulbright English teaching assistant in Mexico and has since taught in public high schools in Southwest Ohio. He has also been an Apple Educator Panel member since 2021 and has been a department chair at Northmont. He has presented at several conferences, Central States, AULA, formerly OFLA, if you're familiar with that organization, and other more local settings, as well as developed webinars and content, informational content for Language Testing International. So Chris, welcome.
Thank you.
And I'm going to hand it off to you to begin your presentation.
All right. Thank you so much, Gosia. So there are a lot of things that I'm going to try to cover, and we have about an hour. So if you guys have some specific questions about things, we'll try to maybe dwell a little bit more on those. And we will try to do some, learn by doing as well. I will say up front, I am a Spanish teacher, so some of the examples will be in Spanish, but hopefully some of the structure and those sorts of things can be kind of applied across whatever language you're coming from. And also, yes, I did spend a year in Mexico. I try to go back just about every year. And so I see some people in the chat. I'm like, oh, I've been there. I've been to Morelia. I've been to Valle de Bravo. I actually was living near Toluca when I was doing that year there. So, and then the other thing, of course, is I teach in Ohio. And typically when we use the Apple in our context, we use it for Ben de Puebla as well. We use it for the seal by literacy. We usually use it with our upper level students. Obviously, there are a lot of other applications as well. And a lot of the things we're going to talk about can kind of apply there. And specifically today, we're going to be talking kind of about backward design, hence charting your course with the Apple. And so I don't want to get ahead of myself too much here, but before we get into that, so if we're using this charting our course metaphor, are you getting ready to embark? Can you see land in the distance? Or are you somewhere out at sea, right? So obviously we're all coming into this with different levels of familiarity with the Apple and that sort of thing. So just kind of think about that as I get into some of these topics. If maybe you're like, can you back up a little bit and go into a little bit more detail on what you mean by that? I'm certainly willing to do that. But I would assume that most of us who are here today already know a little bit about the Apple. Maybe we're already even using it and we're just kind of trying to refine our practice. So as I said, we will do a little bit of learn by doing. And one of the first things I'm going to have you do is choose one of these questions, or maybe more than one of them, and try to answer that in the chat as completely as you can in a minute and 40. Oops. Okay, there we go. Let's see if I can get my back here. And I do. This is also a good point. Good time for me to say. I know somebody in the chat had earlier been asking a question about getting certified to do some of the rating and those sorts of things. And I will say that I have done the 4-day OPI training, and I do highly recommend it if it's something that you can ever find time to do. That's definitely helped shape a lot of the things that I'm going to say today. Shaped kind of my interest in the AAPPL to begin with, as well as my teaching. They really do a fantastic job of kind of running you through the levels and kind of getting you to apply some things from the end point that you want to get to then your instruction along the way. And one of those things is making sure that we're giving students the opportunity along the way to be performing at the levels that we expect them to get to, right? So if we kind of analyze our instruction, we find that we're asking novice level yes, no, either or questions all day long, and we're not giving them necessarily the supports or the number of opportunities to ask those more extended questions where they're showing us series of sentences or showing us more paragraph structure, then kind of trying to analyze, are we only doing that in writing? Are we doing that in writing and speaking or something like that? And so these 3 questions I chose, the first couple are ones that you might find on the interpersonal listening and speaking in those first 9 prompts or so, where you get a minute and 15 to answer. The last one would be a longer prompt. So we've kind of already talked a little bit about me. I'm from Ohio. I've lived in Ohio almost my entire life. Currently, I'm at Northmont High School. I do have some other articles and resources out there. If you're interested to see more of those, you can find those at languagetesting.com. And usually I have Spanish 2 and Spanish 4, some College Credit Plus courses as well. And yeah, there's my little daughter. She's almost a year and a half now. Time goes fast. And there's me playing the banjo. So that's a little bit about me. And this image, this was from the beginning slide as well. Let me scroll back to that, see if we can see it a little bit better. These tags, it's a little bit maybe hard to see on there, but I'll tell you, each of those represents a different class period that I've had and a different year that I've had it. And what I try to do is give my kids ratings along the way. Essentially, every assessment that I run in the class is with an eye towards increasing their proficiency. And so I'm evaluating them on their proficiency on a very regular basis. And so we get a chance to, at the beginning of the year, I catch them where they're coming in and along the way, I'm telling them what their approximate level is. And so they can kind of see that growth. And it also helps a little bit. And this will help as well if you're, adopting the Apple, you can kind of say like, hey, this is the usual expectation for kids in this course. This is a reasonable expectation, and kind of spinning it that way helps some of these kids, instead of having a perfectionist mindset, having more of a mindset of, this is where people are usually getting to. I'm really right in the thick of it. I'm right where I need to be, and getting used to the mistakes being a part of language learning. Try to. All right, I'm gonna let Gosia let me know if there's anything important in the chat. Otherwise, I'm gonna kind of keep going here.
Yeah, there are some questions that I'm taking note of, and we'll answer at the end.
Okay. All right. So the purpose of this, and obviously there's more than just this to building your course, but one of the main things I want to talk about tonight is ways to kind of build out your scope and sequence. So not necessarily just building a unit lesson, but kind of how do your lessons along the way, how do your units along the way fit into the bigger picture. And so everything that we're going to talk about today kind of goes back to preparing kids for the Apple, because it's a real world assessment, because it is a good measure of what they can actually do with the language. And not really, I don't think of it as teaching to the test as much as the test is built around proficiency. The classroom will also be built around proficiency. And those 2 things hand in hand will prepare our kids for real world language use. So what I showed you before, that's where my kids are at, and it roughly corresponds here. The other thing that I would encourage you to do is to share about your own language journey. And I do that with my kids as well. And I find that helps. I have a lot of novice mid, novice high learners in Spanish 2. And to kind of commiserate with them a little bit, kind of talk about how I'm at the advanced high, and talk about, how it is trying to get from a high level to a low level. And basically everybody is on their own learning track, right? So then that's one of the beauties of this system. Obviously, you have to design the activities around where you're trying to get everybody as a whole, but also that individual focus that the Apple allows for, that focusing on the actful statements and all of that allows for. has really been helpful for me developing relationships with my students. Um, and if you have a relatively low level of familiarity with the Apple, most of what I'm going to be talking about is like Apple Form B, but there are two forms. The Apple is designed to rate kids. If you're using the Form A, it'll rate kids from novice 1 all the way up to intermediate 1, which is the equivalent of novice low to intermediate low. And then the Form B, which is what we tend to use, will rate them from N4 or novice high all the way up to advanced low. And anything beyond that, you'd be looking at using the OPI or the WPT. So the AAPPL is based on ACTFL proficiency guidelines. It's the only ACTFL specific test for 3rd through 12th grade. There are 4 sections. Again, I think some of us might have more familiar with the test than others, but I really like it because there is a strong emphasis on intercultural communication, real world type of communication. It does tend to be the case that since we're trying to get our kids in Form B, for instance, or Form A as well, a lot of the questions wind up being about the kid themselves. You could do very well on the AAPPL and not have as much cultural knowledge, but the level that is appropriate for, right? Once you get beyond the intermediate to the advanced is when a lot more of those community sort of conversations happen. We're doing that at the intermediate level as well, but there is a strong focus on talking about yourself, which makes sense based on the level. The 4 sections are reading, listening, writing, and speaking. And the interpersonal listening and speaking, it's the only seal of biliteracy test with this mode. For us in Ohio, to get the seal of biliteracy, which is where we're ultimately trying to get our upper level students, you have to be within 15 months of graduation, and you have to score I5 on at least 3 sections. You can have as low as an I4 on 1 section. If you're Ohio based, which based on the chat, we do have a lot of folks here tonight from Ohio, the magic words are Title 4A funding. I have Ryan Wirtz to thank for keying me into that. He's our main guy over at ODEW, but Title 4A funding in the state of Ohio, we've been able to use those funds to pay to test our upper level students once a year. Ideally, if you have more funding available, the AAPPL is very valuable for tracking kids from when they start every year, potentially even using it as a diagnostic option. I know a lot of states put an emphasis on data and analyzing data. And so the AAPPL has a lot of applications for that as well. And it's a relatively economical test compared to, back when I was in school, we would take the AP test, right? And that costs 4 or 5 times as much. So you could consider, that is kind of a trade-off. It will allow you to test them more times along the way for the same price. The ACTFL proficiency guidelines, they put out a new take in 2024. A lot of it has to do with adding in some more language about intercultural communication and competency. There's some different ways you could do it. Maybe some of you want to sit down and read all 56 pages and take some notes. Another great way to digest that, as I said before, is if you have the time and the ability to do the 4-day OPI rater training, that is really, really valuable. It does take some time, but I would say that if you're looking for something to kind of refresh your teaching, that wouldn't be a bad start. You can also use them as a reference, right? So maybe you want to kind of pull some things here and there, and kind of if you're not sure about a student, or if you want to kind of introduce the idea of proficiency to different teachers in your department or your school, or colleagues that you have, maybe kind of focus in on the levels that are more specific to your preps. And you can also kind of boil them down for your students, which is what I do. And we'll talk a little bit about some ways to do that. But getting back to backward design, according to ACTFL, we're setting proficiency targets for programs, levels, instructional units. We're going to be talking a lot about programs today, but all of those things have implications, right? So once you kind of figure out what you need as a program, then you can break that down into manageable chunks for each level, for each unit. The can-do and the ACTFL proficiency guidelines, those are, I find, really accessible for my students and also for me to kind of figure out where are we trying to get with the unit. And then the world readiness standards as well are very valuable. So we're obviously designing instructional tasks to move towards the learning target. We're trying to embed multiple communication modes. Okay, and then communicating these things to students. Again, I find that with students, and it really does depend on your context a little bit. I'm guessing that maybe some of us are in primary or university, but probably a lot of us are at the high school level. And with my high school kids, I do find that if I can boil it down to a few things, then they really do buy in. If you give them the whole 56 pages, then they might start to check out, right? Okay. And then also self-assessment. That's
Thank
something
you.
that we're going to talk about what that could look like today. So this says see chat for the link, but I think that Gosia is going to send this out after the presentation. So if you're trying to get all of this stuff, I know I kind of talk a little bit fast. And again, Gosia, feel free to break in at any point, and say, hey, could you address this thing that they're talking about in the chat? Right now, I don't have two screens. At work, I usually do, but I'm at home. And so I can't see the chat and present at the same time very easily. But if there's anything that we need to stop and kind of circle back to, just let me know.
No worries. I'm answering some questions in the chat,
Okay.
taking notes and putting some links in there. So no worries.
Fantastic.
We'll be sharing more information and more resources as we go. But yes, this is being recorded, and we will share the recording with everyone who attended.
All right. Thank you. Okay, so scope and sequence, that's the main thing that we're going to talk about. And I will say that this has been pretty valuable in our department as well. I don't know if some of you have experienced this as well, but sometimes there's maybe a difference of teaching philosophy, or teachers are coming from different eras of, the way that they were trained in college and that sort of thing. But if you usually in our department and in the few different schools that I've been into, this isn't a controversial thing, right? When we're talking about the AAPPL standards and we're talking about the AAPPL, people can usually get behind this. And if we can kind of set that up as the big picture, then some of those other difficult discussions about, how do we teach grammar, or how do we teach vocabulary, or how do we do this, or how do we do that, then some of those conversations are a little bit easier to have if we're keeping that as kind of our main goal is to follow that sort of process. And if you're looking for a good book to read, it's an oldie but a goodie. From Input to Output by Bill Van Patten is a good one. There's a lot of other things out there, and there's more than one way to get where we're trying to get. There's, obviously comprehensible input can have a lot of applications for what we're talking about, but you don't necessarily have to do the whole, the TPRS little kicking with your hands and stuff like that to necessarily get where you're trying to go. And I know that works for a lot of teachers. There's also things like organic world language and all that. I will say, really, I'm kind of a hodgepodge of a few different methods. But regardless of your method, one of the things that the AAPPL will allow you to do is to develop some of those best practices, because you're seeing where your students are at. So instead of having that conversation with the other teachers in your department and everybody saying, well, my kids are good, or that sort of thing, you have actual numbers that you can look at. And that has helped us to make some tweaks to some of the ways that we're doing some things. Because obviously there is that inertia of, well, we've been doing this for 5 years or 10 years, maybe even 20 years. And we really don't want to rewrite the curriculum because that's a lot of work. And so having this sort of data can help people be more willing to change some of the practices that they're doing. And I'm not saying that they need to be working overtime or anything like that, but just having that willingness to explore a different way of doing things can sometimes come out of the conversation that you can have when you have hard data like what AAPPL would provide. And I'm not going to go in too much more detail about the data side of things. I do have a 3-part blog that you can look at that kind of walks through that what that process looked like at our institution. But definitely it's very valuable. It will provide you data by teacher. It'll provide you data by which mode they're doing year over year. And there's really a lot of possibilities with that. Also, again, going back to that discussion of every kid grows differently, that sort of data is amazing to kind of see and appreciate that growth, rather than just appreciating our highest learners, also appreciating the learners who grow the most. I do have a sample scope and sequence. This is actually something that we're revisiting right now at my school because we're up for textbook acquisition. And so we're exploring some different things. And as we're exploring those resources, we're keeping in mind kind of the principles of the AAPPL and ACTFL. And so navigate away to this. But before I do, this is kind of the main thing, right? If we're talking about scope and sequence, where we started was, well, the Seal of Biliteracy in Ohio, it's a recognition for our top students. Excuse me. And so that's where we want to be at program end. So because of that, it's our juniors and seniors that need to be at the intermediate high level or better. So we need our level 2 and 3 students to be at the intermediate low or mid level, which means our level 1 students need to be getting to novice mid or novice high. Okay, so this allowed us to successfully advocate for a middle school program. Now our 8th graders, about 80 or 90% of them will take either a semester or a year of Spanish, which gives us a little bit more lead time to get where we're going. And it also helps us to get kids excited about our College Credit Plus program, which prepares them better. It's a little bit more rigorous commitment than our regular Spanish 2, 3, and 4 would be. It's essentially our honors track. But so if kids hear about the seal by literacy, they get kind of excited about it. And also as teachers too, we know that our goal is to get more students to earn the seal by literacy. Then also we're trying to convince more students to take the more challenging curriculum. It could also, we're not quite there yet, but it could also lead to conversations about adding a 5th year. So at least in Ohio, a lot of our schools, our enrollment is going down a little bit over time. There's just kind of a trend. And so having something like this built in gives us a little bit more of attractive program and gets our kids more bought in. And we're hoping that this will help kind of keep some of the kids that we have more committed to staying it out for a little bit longer. And we've had some success with that, and then some unintended consequences as well. But on the whole, it's been very, very positive for us. So the rubrics. I believe Apple has been adding some new stuff. I haven't had a chance to look at everything, but I would recommend that for you in your classroom, whatever that might look like, I would try to make sure that on a fairly regular basis, you're using the AAPPL standards incorporated into your rubrics in some manner. I would also recommend that, if you are starting with what I have, and these rubrics are in English. So regardless of where you're coming from, if you're on this Zoom right now, I'm assuming that you have a high enough level of English that you could take this and kind of tweak it for how you need it. These are obviously free for you. These are something that I came up with. They're based on the 2012 standards. It might need a little bit of a tweak, but let me take a look at that with you real quick. Okay, so I have students at different levels, and I'm not going to spend the entire time just talking about these rubrics. I'm also going to go through some samples of feedback with students and those sorts of things as well. But I think I have skipped a step. This won't make as much sense without first having looked at the scope and sequence. So we've talked about this a little bit already. Some of these ideas are kind of already embedded in the conversation we've been having. But for us, when I got to our school about 10 years ago, we were still kind of coming off that time when a lot of the teachers were more interested in the grammar and vocabulary side of things. I don't know if even old school is the right word for it, but just kind of, the units that we have are built around these things. So therefore the students must memorize these rules and this vocabulary. And there can still be a place for that depending on how it's used. However, one of the things that you will want to do is think a little bit more about whether those topics that you have built into your units are things that you want and expect reasonably that your students can acquire by the end of your course or the end of your unit. Are they things that they may be able to do about half of the time? Or are they things that they're just starting to kind of learn? And that kind of mimics a little bit, right, of that mid, high, and low, right? So if you're at the novice high, obviously, the novice mid, you have some recognition of the present tense, you have some idea of it, but if you can do it 50% or more of the time, then we're really talking more novice high. If you've really got it down and a little bit more automatic, then we're talking intermediate low, intermediate mid. And so basically what we did was we looked at the grammar and vocabulary that's kind of embedded in our program and kind of broke down at what point are we expecting students to have just some introduction, some recognition of, some ability to do it about half of the time versus having it acquired. And obviously that will vary a little bit by group. But I would encourage you, as you're doing things like developing a program and a plan for 3 to 5 years of education, or possibly more than that, to kind of sit down and decide which of these things, for instance, you expect students to have fully comprehended at different points. And if you're keeping in mind the AAPPL and the AAPPL, right, some of those things may not be quite as necessary quite as early as we would think, right? So if we're talking about the past tense, we tend to introduce the past tense in my context, we tend to introduce it in the second year. My students are very bad at it, right? They require a lot of working it, and we cannot just assume that after a semester they'll know the past tense. We have to assume that that's something that they're going to continue to be working on, continue to be working on, continue to be working on. And then that might also tell us, things that are a little bit more complex, like circumlocution, or using the subjunctive. Things like those might have to come a little bit later. It's not that we don't try to do those things. It's not that we don't introduce them and those sorts of things. But when you're talking scope and sequence, you really want to make sure that you're circling back to those key items that are going to be, for instance, of the intermediate level, right? Making sure that our students continue to have that practice with the present tense constantly, right? And as we're introducing those other tenses, that we just have the recognition that it's going to take them time to get them down. And so that's kind of been one of the ways that we have focused our discussion in our department, away from just, that the conflict of, which textbook do we use or which methodology do we use, and kind of looking at the realistic expectations that we might have for our kids. And for instance, today I was talking with my fourth year kids, and they hadn't heard of the conditional yet. they hadn't heard of the subjunctive yet, and they were freaking out a little bit, like they were a little bit behind. And I tried to point out to them, we are going to cover those things this year, but also you wouldn't necessarily have to know those things in order to function well in daily life, or in order to function well on the AAPPL test. Obviously, you want to build some recognition, and obviously we're going to work to a point where they can maybe start to use some of those things, first as chunks, and then later as more creative utterances, but that they already know how to use the present tense and the past tense pretty well, and the basic future. They're already setting themselves up to be able to interact pretty well in most daily situations. And so getting back to the rubric side of things, there is then a way to kind of make this make sense, right? In terms of grading, I assume that most of us on this chat, or maybe all of us on this chat, are expected to provide grades for our students, maybe just beyond. I know my administrators would be very confused if I told them I'm not going to be giving letter grades this year. I'm going to just be giving the level that they're at, right? But there is a way to kind of translate those two things together. So now that we've seen the scope and sequence a little bit, let me just focus in on a second year course, for instance. If you're in my second year course, you should not be at the novice low level. These are grades these are percentages essentially. So if I have a kid, and I did have a few when we took a quiz, and there were some open-ended questions asking things about what activities they like to do and things like that. If they essentially left it blank, or maybe had a couple of answers, but very, very incomplete, really at the one word level, or uses some words out of context, then they're going to get a very low grade. That's an F or a D, depending. Their 100% expectation for me right now, first semester, would be that they can operate at the intermediate low level, creates original statements and questions based on familiar material, actively participates, for instance, if we're having a conversation, or a simple written back and forth, short conversational statements and sentences. These things are all pulled directly from the AAPPL guidelines. The beauty of this is that I will do speaking assessments with my students, and after the speaking assessment, I can read to them the statements from the level. And I have yet to have a student say, well, no, I think I actually used sentences and series of sentences. The 10 times out of 10, they'll say, yes, that I agree. That sounds like what I was doing. And so it's a little bit less conflictive too. It kind of creates that conversation with the student that allows them to kind of reflect a little bit and to kind of understand like what is it that you're looking for. And it also promotes that they're practicing the language because in order to be successful in a system like this, you need to be prepared to respond to a variety of situations. It's not quite as simple as just memorizing a few things the night before. Okay, and then here's the other part of the reflection. There's a lot of different ways that you can do reflection. I do recommend that you do it on a relatively regular basis. And make this a little bit bigger. I'm going to show you how I've been doing this for the past few years. The other thing that I like to start the year off with, and I hate to say, I think a couple of these links are probably broken. Yeah, there we go. If I can, I'll try to edit this because the information that's on here is housed elsewhere. But the gist of it is at the beginning of the year, so before we've really even done anything, I will present to my students samples of speakers at the level that I expect them to get to by the end of the course. And so it kind of gives them a chance to see and hear. And also then I'll do a diagnostic test and give them an idea of about where they are coming in. And this really, it looks very simple. It is fairly simple, but I will tell you that this has been a big motivator for a lot of my students because regardless of whether they're coming in at, like I do have one student who came into Spanish 2 at intermediate low. He's in the wrong class. He should be in the College Credit Plus course, but he chose not to take that. But besides him, regardless of whether a student is coming in at novice low or mid or high, even if they feel like they're a little bit behind some of their some of the other kids in their class, they're still able to kind of look at like, well, this is where I'm at. These are some things that I need to do to improve. And the other thing that I remind them of as well is that this is designed as a cone because when you're at the lower levels, it is faster to grow, right? So if you're at the novice low and you're trying to get to novice high, you should be able to get there. If you're putting in the time and the effort, you should be able to get there quicker than somebody could get from intermediate low to intermediate high, right? And so that's another thing that especially my second year students, I kind of tell them that a lot because if you're starting behind, that can help you kind of feel a lot of what we're doing has to do with child psychology, and some of it has to do with language teaching, right? And then I do have them set some goals for themselves. But kind of the important thing that I started doing a few years back is then at the end of every quarter, they revisit where are they at. So I give them some sort of assessment that gives them a rough idea of where they're at. These numbers are based off of the Ohio Department of Education and Workforce equivalents, but it's basically, we're talking novice low, novice mid, novice high, intermediate low, intermediate mid. And you can change those numbers however you want. I would just recommend that you have a large enough set that students can see their growth, right? If all you have is N1, N2, N3, N4, N5, and then I1, I2, I3, I4, I5, then some students can get a little bit discouraged just because they don't feel necessarily that they're growing as fast as they want to. But that's another discussion to have with them as well about how it does take time and there's that U-shaped curve of proficiency and all of that. Sometimes they might feel like they're not improving, but as long as they continue to put in the work and as long as they continue to challenge themselves, eventually they may have a breakthrough. It just might not feel like it for a while. So for my kids, I have them do kind of a self-assessment, and then they write some things down there. And then I'll go around and talk to each of those kids too each quarter. And they do that every quarter. So they'll have done it 4 times in the year. And it kind of gives them a map of where they've come from and where they've gone. And again, if you're able to use the AAPPL more than once a year, that would definitely help with this discussion as well, or year over year as well. You could, in theory, you could even have them continue a model like this and have them do it every year and look back at what they had written previously. I'm looking at the time. I think I still have a little bit of time here. I want to make sure I don't leave too much out here at the end. Okay, yeah, I'm not doing too bad, I think. So we've kind of talked about the overall program design, and I just want to take a few minutes to kind of give you an idea of unit design, and I think we might even get to some feedback and stuff like that as well. But so to give an example, for one of the courses that I had last year, it was a combined honors Spanish 4 and a college credit plus 2202. But regardless of what level we're talking about, the process is the same. We start with the proficiency goals and we work backwards, right? So in this case, what was my content? Sometimes we are limited in what we can use. Other times we do have choices of what we can use. In this case, for the College Credit Plus course, we were required to use this acceso.ku.edu. It's an open educational resource and it's online, it's for free. It's actually not that bad. If you're teaching an upper level Spanish course, this might be something to check out if you're not familiar with it. So that was the content we were using. The proficiency goals from that rubric that I showed you before for Spanish 4, the 100% was intermediate high. For the 2202 course, it was advanced low. And then more specific objectives. And I believe that a number of these came from Acceso itself, but I can get the main idea and many details from short interviews and texts about cultures and current events in Venezuela, Colombia, and Panama. I can discuss, compare, contrast, and create different foods in a respectful way. I can identify some career options involving languages and give details. I can discuss, compare, and contrast a cultural event and create something inspired by it. So this was also part of something called Languages Week, which is right at the beginning of March. And so I basically, regardless of what you're doing, I know that sometimes we feel constrained by, our department is doing this, or we're required to do this, or we don't have time to get to this. You can often adapt what you're doing already to some of these considerations of the AAPPL standards and kind of prepare your kids for the AAPPL. And so what we were doing was Language Week, where we had different students doing different presentations throughout the week and things like that. And the main focus last year was Carnaval. And so we had, I created a listening activity and a reading activity for them, kind of geared around that. But what's maybe more interesting to this discussion was their speaking. So I had them, and there are some good resources out there. I do have a couple of full-length practice tests, which are probably linked somewhere in this PowerPoint, or if not, they're definitely in a previous webinar that I've done. But sometimes it's also valuable to have the students come up with some questions, kind of put them in the driver's seat a little bit. And I have a version of this in English as well that's linked in the presentation. But so the general idea here was that, we'd been talking about these different things throughout the year. This was in the third quarter. And so what they had to do was spin the wheel, and they had a little bit of time, maybe about 30 seconds or so. They had to be the tester, and they had to come up with a question, for instance, about science, something related to what we've been talking about in class. And then their partner would have to respond to that question. And the way that I usually like to do speaking is that I have the kids in pairs and they kind of rotate around and talk to different people. And so in this case, I had them sitting with the same person for quite a while, so that they could ask and answer a number of different questions and try to mirror that ILS sort of structure. But then I will go around, and as the kids are rotating, I would make sure that I saw everybody at least once. And at the end, I would take a couple minutes to kind of walk them through those comments, as I had mentioned earlier. And give them some idea of some questions ahead of time as well. Excuse me. So, and then as far as activity design goes, there are some caveats and some things, and obviously everybody's going to have their own opinion about this, and maybe there's some things that I'm wrong about. But as far as AI goes, I haven't found that to be particularly helpful yet, even in activity creation. The questions in the AAPPL test, those are in English with the exception of the interpersonal listening and speaking. You may want to give your kids some practice with that. And the reason that they're in English, my understanding anyway, is that then that kind of ensures that the kids aren't just regurgitating but that they do truly understand what they're talking about. But so you might include some questions in English. I usually keep my questions in the target language. Between technology and paper, I would recommend some sort of a combination. You do want an accurate read. And of course, what I mean by that is it's easier and easier for kids to over rely on tools that are essentially functioning like translators for them. And so although you do want them to be prepared for the format of the Apple, which is digital, you might also want to do a number of things on paper just so that they are developing their own autocorrect in their brain and not relying too much on autocorrect or on translation or anything like that. And then also, as you do activities and then students perform on the Apple, we're constantly going back and refining. So let's say maybe in the past, one of my weaknesses was I did not provide them enough speaking opportunities. And I can tell you, as someone who has been administering the Apple for 6 or 7 years now, that our students tend to have the most challenges on the speaking section. That has gotten better, it has improved, but it's inherently the most difficult section. And so if you find that your kids are really, really good at writing and you're scratching your head wondering why maybe they're not as good at speaking, then you might want to put a little bit more emphasis on the speaking, even if it means that you're spending a little bit less time on writing. Some other things, Apple performance is not always linear. Sometimes students fall into a hothouse topic, right? Something that they know a lot about and they get really excited about and they can do really well on. Other times, they may find a topic that they haven't covered in class yet, right? And so that's another thing that you'll want to consider is how can you cover some generic vocabulary that they can then apply to multiple different scenarios, and also how can you cover a larger number of topics. And so there's the English version of that as well. And I talked a little bit about this earlier, but again, for your activities, you want to keep in mind that if someone is functioning at the novice level, they're usually pretty good about talking about themselves. If we're pushing into the intermediate level, then we're able to talk more about our surroundings and people we know well and stuff like that. And then really when we're talking about the wider community or talking about the world, then we're really talking more about advanced plus level. And so sometimes maybe when we're recalibrating what we're doing, maybe the activity was too hard, maybe the activity was too easy, or maybe they just didn't have the scaffolds to do it. But just in terms of realistic expectations, make sure that if your students are at that novice level, that's where your biggest focus is on simple situations like talking about themselves, etc. And then we've talked about a few of these things, but as far as the different modes, interpretive, interpersonal, presentational, when I was doing this activity, I tied a few different things in there. There are a lot of good different reading sources out there now. The ones that I used for this to help prepare students for, these are both in that free online resource that I was telling you about called accesso.ku.edu. And I'm not going to dedicate time to talking about what other resources there are out there because there are so many. But you may consider, trying to mimic the Apple a little bit when you're making your assessments. And so, for instance, for their reading, they had a total of 10 multiple choice questions. There were 5 and 5, 5 for each reading. Same with for their listening. For interpersonal, this is something that sometimes we struggle with, right? Is finding situations to get our students in to do conversations that are one-on-one. Obviously, we want to be doing a lot of those with their own classmates, but then there are also some other resources out there. Talk Abroad is not affiliated with Language Testing International, but they are a resource that I've used a lot, and it's something to look into. It's not free, but it can provide those opportunities for you to have your classes talk to a native speaker, either in a whole class setting or one-on-one or small group setting. And there is also Language Testing International's Level Up Village, which provides a similar opportunity. And we've kind of already talked about these other things a little bit. Individualized feedback. I do want to make sure, and I've just got a few minutes left here before I kind of turn it over to Q&A. I think is this the secret link? I think it is. Yes. Okay. So there was that resource that I was telling you about before that doesn't have the resources that it used to, but they're all here. They're all embedded on this other site. So what this is, and I'll just talk about this for about 30 seconds and then switch to talking about feedback, is for the beginning of the year, if you're trying to introduce your students to proficiency, this website has good explanations of each level, and it has embedded videos of speakers at each level. So if you don't have the time or the money or the interest to do, like, for instance, an OPI training, if you can find this link back, oercommons.org, and it's got some other things there. If you can find that link, that is a very, very good place to start. And so when you're doing individualized feedback, do try to use that terminology from AAPPL/Apple/Linguafolio. Do try to be consistent. I do use the same language every time that I rate students on speaking or writing. I use those same rubrics. That sounds a little bit lazy. However, I have found that it leads to better discussions than if I'm constantly presenting them with a new rubric. And so I'll have students, for 3 years in a row or things like that. And they're really bought in. They really understand what's going on for what we're looking for. And then also really focus on what the student demonstrates. This isn't a judgment on them as a person. It's just a judgment on what they have said in that specific interaction and that sort of thing. And then also, how often were they able to do the things that you were looking for, and kind of basically tell them how to score better. That gets them bought in a little bit more. Brian's one of the people from that website. And then also consider, what are you going to have those students do with that feedback? Because the worst possible thing would be for you to spend a relatively long amount of time. And once you've been doing it for a while, I will tell you, it doesn't take quite as long as some of the other ways you could give feedback. But what are the students going to do with that? The worst thing would be for them to get the feedback from you, look at the grade, and move on with their life, right? You want to make sure that they're doing something with it. Are you going to have them, if it's a writing or a speaking, for instance, you're going to have them redo it? Are you going to have them maybe highlight certain things that they noticed, like maybe ask them to highlight the verbs that they used? Or are you going to ask them like to expand what they wrote by 50% or by 50 words or whatever it might be? Are you going to ask them to reflect? What are you going to have them do with that feedback? This is an example that's in Spanish. This is for one of my students from Spanish 4 from last year. And so this was for speaking practice. His estimated level was novice high, which in level 4 he shouldn't be, but the language that he demonstrated on that day was. And so and I'll say this in English here, because I know we're not all Spanish teachers, but he did respond with relevant information. He had a decent use of high frequency verbs in the present tense, but he's really got to be careful with conjugating his verbs. At least 5 times he left us with a phrase rather than a complete sentence by not conjugating a verb, and those are indicated below. These are notes that I took while he was speaking. I do not recommend, some of you may disagree with me, but I don't take things home. As much as possible, I will grade speakings while they're doing it. That saves you a lot of time. It also allows for stations. So kids are talking the whole time, and you're just grading them while you're watching them and putting it down on paper. It saves you a lot of time, and they're still getting the feedback that they need. Let's see here. So I also recommended to him that every time he hears himself make a mistake of conjugation, that he correct it immediately. Also told him he's got a decent basic vocab, a lot of good cognates, and to keep expanding that. So that's kind of an example, and I'm kind of out of time to show you any other examples here. I'm just going to check and make sure there's nothing else major that I've kind of skipped, but we're pretty much at the end. So I'm going to see if I can't get the screen back where I want it, and I'm going to open it up to questions.
Okay. The chat is very lively, Chris.
Oh, good.
I think your presentation is really resonating with a lot of the educators who joined us. A lot of questions about, will you share the presentation? But I believe you shared some of the links already, right? We can also, in our follow-up email, we can include the link to it.
Okay.
So there was a lot of questions about rubrics, and I am really happy to let everybody know that just Monday, AAPPL made the new Apple Classroom Assessment rubrics for the presentational writing and interpersonal listening speaking available. They went live on Monday, along with a 30-minute training video about what the Apple is and things like that. So there are rubrics available now, and they describe learner abilities and provide feedback suggestions. Educators can design classroom-based performance assessments modeled after the Apple tasks and evaluate responses and identify strengths and areas for improvement. So really great resource. So if you are using the Apple in your program, those rubrics are available under resources in your client site. So if your program is using the Apple, your administrator can give you access to that through the client side. If you are not, then please contact Language Testing International to learn how to become the Apple client. So this is for just to follow up, presentational writing and interpersonal listening speaking. So both productive skills are covered in the rubric. So that's a great resource.
And I do see another couple of questions in there that I'm not sure that we've addressed
Go
yet
ahead,
that I'd like to
Chris.
answer.
Jump
So
right in.
Lucy says, how do you design assessment for interpersonal tasks for a big class? When there are 2 or more students talking, do you also grade all of their speaking at the same time? Do you assess their speaking one by one? So what I was referring to there, and I have had classes as large as 31 that I've done this with. Fortunately, usually my classes are smaller than that. But it can take me a couple of class days, but I do find it valuable. So let me just give you a scenario. So if I've got my, let's say I have 30 students and I've got them in 15 different stations, or maybe I've got them in bigger groups than 2 people per group. If I just can't take the amount of time to do that, then maybe I put them in groups of 3 or groups of 4. But I've already come up with a list of you're here to start. And then basically it's half of the class kind of stays in their position, the other half rotates. And then I'm rotating in the opposite direction. And usually it works out that I'll be able to see everybody talk at least once. And so every station is essentially doing the same thing. For instance, I might give them a list of questions and a couple of dice to roll to see what question they have. And that question relates back to the content that we've been working on. Or I might give them one of them that I do it's like a presentation with pictures in it that are related back to what we've been talking about, and they have to talk about that. Or as I had talked about previously, maybe one of the person's role in the group is to come up with a question. The group talks about it, and then the next person asks a question, and then they rotate. And so they're all doing the communication task at the same time. They're just not all getting graded at the same time. They just get graded when I'm sitting there. So they kind of rotate every 5 or 10 minutes, as the case may be. And then one other question that I saw in there was, I know some teachers are against the idea of prepping students for Apple. They believe the results should come from unprepared and unrehearsed production. What do you think? I'll give you the same answer that I got from one of my professors he was talking about the OPI, but it's a similar thing. It's essentially you can't, right? I mean, the only way to quote unquote, I guess, game the test would be by being so prepared in so many different tasks that you do have that functional competency that we're looking for. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer or not, but
Yeah, just to follow up on that, Jen answered in the chat that we try to emphasize preparing for a successful testing experience on the Apple, which includes providing students with lots of opportunities for unrehearsed production of language. So it's really not test prep, but really creating opportunities to use language in different contexts, sort of unrehearsed production of language. There's also a question about topics on the Apple. You can find that information on the ACTFL's website, actfl.org. LTI's website has that information as well. So just if you visit those websites, you'll find information about the topics, Apple topics. Thank you, Chris, for sharing the latest newsletter with us. If you're not receiving the Apple newsletters monthly, I encourage you to sign up. We share, what's new releases, and interesting updates. All that is in our monthly newsletter. So please sign up. If you need to contact us to see how you can sign up, just reach out to me. I'm going to put my email in the chat. We have some great new releases. Just this Monday, we launched the American Sign Language for the Apple. So first ever actual assessment for American Sign Language, which is really exciting. Actually, someone from the Ohio Department of Ed reached out today and asked some questions, adding that to the website for the Seal of Literacy. The rubrics that we mentioned earlier, there are extended Apple demos. I think there was a question about how students can practice, taking the test. So it's really not practice, it's a demo. It kind of gives the students the experience of taking the test. As we said, you can't really test prep, right? But you can see you can show students what you expect. We also have an extended demo that's also available through the client side. So lots of great new releases and updates. And of course, the content was refreshed. The content on the Apple is refreshed every year. So starting Monday, if you are administering the test after this Monday, you are getting the refreshed content. So lots of great resources. Okay, any other questions? They're just flying in so quickly. I don't know if you noticed, Chris. Any
I
other
noticed a lot of
questions
thank yous,
that,
and I will say thank you all for coming. I mean, I know this is a time
yeah,
commitment, and I know I have a tendency to talk quickly, so hopefully you got something out of it.
yes. So, okay, how to become ACTFL Apple certified. So, Isabel, I assume that you're asking how to become a certified Apple rater. So ACTFL opens the window to apply to become the rater. I think it closed in August, so I think you have to wait for the next one to open. But ACTFL provides a course to become the certified Apple rater, and once you get certified, then you work with LTI to rate the tests. So yeah, Jen put a link to that in the chat. So if you're interested, bookmark that link. Apple content is refreshed every year. Yes, Lucy. There was also a question. So, there are a lot of unique features of the Apple, but Chris, you mentioned that earlier in your presentation. It's the only test that measures the interpersonal mode of communication as opposed to presentational. So that's really, if I would have to give one unique, this is what really I think stands out, that it measures the interpersonal communication. Anything else, Chris, that you
The only thing
jump out?
I would say is back to the rehearsal question. One thing I'll say I've been working a lot with my students on this year, especially my upper level students, is what is a good anecdote, right? So kind of working on those structures of making sure that when somebody is giving an extended answer on an open-ended question about themselves, that they're doing a short introduction, they're giving key details, and they're coming out with some sort of a conclusion, and just kind of teaching those structures, and not necessarily, it's not like they're memorizing an answer, but they're kind of coming up with those patterns that they can apply to a wide variety of situations.
Yeah. Isabel, just to answer your question, so the demos available on the website to just give a sort of a sense of what the test is about, but there are extended demo. There is an extended demo available through the client site. We launched that earlier this year. So again, through the client side, you can access those extended demos. They have more prompts that you could demonstrate
I
to
mean, I would also
students.
encourage you to kind of incorporate that structure that you know is on the Apple, and kind of come up with your own demo test, applying some of the things that your students have learned throughout the year as well. I found that to be helpful.
And the rubrics will definitely help as well. So we encourage you to check them out next time you log into the client side. Well, thank you so much. This was wonderful, Chris. And as always, I learn something new every time you present. So thank you for that. Thank you everybody for joining us. I know it was super early for some of you, dinner time for, some of you. So thank you for spending this afternoon with us, and stay tuned for upcoming webinars, and of course the email follow-up with the link to the presentation. And with that, thanks, Chris. I
Thank
want to
you.
wish you all a wonderful day or evening. Take care.